So are they going to call Philadelphia today or not?
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for your patience. Our students so excited today that, it barely can come out of lecture. Needless to say why.
Yeah, exactly.
Needless to
Okay.
explain why. It's just, but we're so glad to have you here.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And I see that, and I see a lot of regular people which are coming to the circle. Hello, Terry. Hello, Milan, Dan, the other Dan. Very glad to see
It's
you
like
now.
Vlad is here, Jacob, Keith.
Yes. We see people that, and I know that other people as well are coming. So if you are willing, just wait half a minute, so people would be able to join us.
Sure.
In any case, Yasmin, equally interesting things on the Balkan. Frane is coming.
Yeah.
And I think that, of course, American election, process has been so hot. I was just looking at the Serbian press this morning. And,
Oh yeah, what are they saying?
you had those rallies, for pro-Trump rallies,
Right.
of people,
Yeah.
so with those flags and
Right.
multiple sort of interesting things. And the joke in Bulgarian press this morning is what we're gonna do immediately after first Trump election. There was something called Trump Общество. Trump Society that was, instituted and actually inspired by local politicians and people that thought that this is a dawn of new era, which in certain sense is. But now they were asking, there was like common joke and memes going around, like what are we gonna do now with this type of society? Is it going to rebrand itself or?
Are they going to have a Biden Общество?
Exactly. Biden. So, in any case, thank you all for coming today and still, joining us. And thanks for Yasmin's patience. I'm so excited. This is the 11th iteration for this season. Yasmin, we udarnici. We do not like to miss a beat of any of the semester.
Sure.
And Balkan Circle has become a point of gravity for all things Balkan, as you know, at UT. Thanks to my co-host today, Professor Mary Newberger, and I'll let her introduce herself for those of you that are, which is not probably the case, but still, as an opening, of the person that has been the primary supporter and a backer of this initiative. And we're covering a very wide topics. And today we're about to talk about something very, very important, I believe, in terms of political stability projection, and of course, related to your fantastic book that you will, and I hope people will have a chance to read. But Balkan Circle has become also an arena for people at the University of Texas at Austin, faculty and students alike, to present and workshop their work, but also to have the critical look of our colleagues in academia and practitioners, because our sort of laser sharp focus is on all things Balkan. Having said that, Professor Newberger, I will let you open today's session before we introduce our wonderful speaker today.
Yeah, so for those of you, I think most of you know me, but my name is Mary Newberger. I'm a historian of Bulgaria, actually, in the history department here at UT. And I also am the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the chair of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. And we've kept our Balkan Circle sort of small on purpose, but we're slowly kind of bringing people into it. And we hope, Yasmin, if you want to come in the future as an audience member and participant, that would be great too. We always have a great conversation after our speakers present, and we have a combination of students, faculty, and we cross disciplines with kind of all things Balkan. So now Kirill will go ahead and introduce you.
Yes. Well, today our speaker is of a profile that I enjoy a lot, in a sense that, yes, more people are joining. Yasmin is a academic figure, but also has a practical engagement with the Balkan. with the Balkans. He is a political scientist and analyst of Southeastern European and international affairs with a PhD from York University in Toronto. Also, he is a co-host of a popular regional podcast, which is called Sarajevo Calling. And until recently, he was a limited term assistant professor of political science and policy studies at Elon University. His career is a blend between practical engagements, which he probably will tell us a little bit about, and very good academical observations and analysis on political, social, and cultural developments on the Balkans, and specifically on, connected with something he will be talking about today, about political, social, and cultural dynamics on the Western Balkans. Without further ado, Yasmin, very glad to have you today here on the 11th iteration of Balkan Circle at the University of Texas at Austin.
Well, thank you guys so much. This has been an extremely generous both invitation and introduction. It's also extremely humbling to be invited by somebody like Kirill, whose work I know well and I'm really, really impressed by. And likewise, thank you so much to Professor Neuberger for that invitation to join your sessions in future. That's something I would love to take you guys up on. And thank you, of course, to everyone here who's made the time. I know we're all spending so much time outside right now that it's really difficult to find the time to sit down in front of the computer. I obviously I want to acknowledge the fact that we, there's some pretty big news in the United States right now, and I do think it's actually relevant to the conversation that we want to have today, if for no other reason than it appears that it appears at this moment, President-elect Biden, as a Bosnian analyst noted a couple of days ago in the Bosnian media, may very well be the first American president who will not need a Balkan advisor, because Vice President and now President-elect Biden is very familiar with the region indeed. I don't know whether that will in fact be the case, but I think it is worthwhile unpacking a little bit about how and whether American policy towards the region will change, and I certainly invite questions on that topic, but I wanted to sort of flag it right from the get-go. I'll kind of give you a basic sense of what I want to say and also why I think it matters. I think for those of you that have done any kind of serious sustained reading or study on the Western Balkans, or, AKA the former Yugoslavia, minus Slovenia plus Albania, right? That's the definition of the Western Balkans, apparently, which I reject, mind you. Slovenia is absolutely part of the pile, so don't let anyone tell you otherwise. When you encounter the academic literature, you will find a very large number of texts and studies from the 1990s. So during the war years, you're going to find some stuff up to about the middle of the 2000s into a later portion of the 2000s. And then pretty much from that point on, it dries up, right? Because the literature that exists for the most part on the region, or at least the sort of halcyon days of the literature on the region in the West, were either primarily concerned with the war, with questions about international law, human rights law, the ICTY, things like that, or they were kind of in the canon of state building and democratization literature. So there's a lot of comparative studies, with places like Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, plus then Lebanon, Iraq, Northern Ireland, this kind of stuff. And that of course is a hugely important and informative literature. But what ended up happening towards the end of the 2000s from the academic perspective is that, a lot of that interest disappeared. And I think what's interesting to note there is that not only did the academic interest disappear, but realistically speaking, so did the policy interest. And that in many ways is actually sort of the primary thing that I want to talk about. And I want to give you perhaps a slightly different version of recent Western Balkan history than perhaps you're familiar with. Basically, what ended up happening in the region is that after 9/11, the focus of the United States in terms of its overall foreign policy posture obviously changed radically, right? The fact that Bosnia and Kosovo arguably were sort of the pinnacles of post-Cold War American diplomacy, right? Where the United States in particular most successfully flexed its proverbial diplomatic, but also military muscle. That kind of narrative was of a bygone era, because 9/11 was such a dramatic, radical inflection point in American history, and thereby also global history, right? And so already by 2003, you have the extremely important EU summit in Thessaloniki in Greece, where European leaders make the pitch to the Western Balkans. And the pitch is the following: if you engage in reform, if you restructure your political regimes, your economic regimes, your social regimes, if you undertake a process of sustained Europeanization, we leave the door open for you to join the largest and most successful economic bloc in human history. And that will be, as it were, the kind of glorious prize at the end that should drive you to continue the process of peace building, state building, democratization, et cetera, et cetera. And the United States will, in a practical sense, no longer be involved in this process. The United States is involved on a kind of over the horizon standpoint, in particular in places like Bosnia and Kosovo, because of maintaining relatively small peacekeeping contingencies, but even over time that dissipates. And in a place like Bosnia today, you have like 650 peacekeepers, and they're all European. That's the kind of proverbial passing of the torch that happens, right? The US has bigger fish to fry. It's going off to the Middle East. It's going off to Iraq. It's going off to Afghanistan. It's engaging in the global war on terror. The Europeans are taking over in their own backyard, right? So now it's the reset of what you attempted or you were supposed to have famously in the early 1990s, what was pitched as the Hour of Europe, which of course didn't work out. But here we go again. Right, here we go again. And so the idea is that this is in the wheelhouse of the European Union, because the EU has, the idea is, the transformative capacity to entice Western Balkan regimes to transform themselves, to become EU members, because that is the model that we have just seen in Eastern Europe, right? That is the model that you have seen in Poland, Hungary, eventually Bulgaria, Romania, et cetera, right? So it's the same blueprint, more or less. So what ends up happening? We want to sort of leave lots of time for conversation and let's get to the meat of it. So what ends up happening? Well, the short version and kind of the basic thesis of a lot of my analysis, and certainly the book, is that fundamentally the European approach doesn't work out. Right? It doesn't work out. And there's a number of important reasons why it doesn't work out, and it's worth unpacking those. The basic structural one is that the comparison between the former Eastern Bloc countries and the former Yugoslav states is not one-to-one, right? It's just not one-to-one. The Yugoslav dissolution and the Yugoslav wars, which last for a decade, end up resulting in the deaths of somewhere in the neighborhood of 150,000 people. 100,000 of those alone are in Bosnia. You have mass displacement of populations. You have the collapse of entire societies, including in places like Serbia, which, in comparison to most of the region, saw relatively little fighting, notwithstanding the NATO air campaign, right? There is a wholesale social, economic, and political collapse that happens in this region that cannot be compared to what ends up happening virtually anywhere else in the Eastern Bloc states, notwithstanding obviously places like Moldova or what we're seeing in places like Ukraine today, right? So the nature of the challenge in the Western Balkans is much greater than it is in the former Eastern Bloc states. So that's number one. Number two, the reality is that the European Union lacks the tools and also eventually lacks the will to engage in the kind of sustained political transformation that is necessary to affect sustained change in these societies, right? I mean, the places where the European project is most successful are Slovenia and eventually Croatia. Now, why is that? Well, it's the two countries in the former Yugoslavia that were sort of arguably, quote unquote, the most liberal to begin with, although that's a very contentious claim and not necessarily one I completely agree with, but there is some merit to it, right? They were certainly the most economically successful. And they also had, in comparison to most of the rest of the region, the most settled political status, right? They were internally quite politically homogenous, right? And obviously you say in a place like Croatia, well, in no small part because virtually the entire ethnic Serb population was expelled or fled, as it were, at the end of the war. So there it is. When you start getting into places like Bosnia, when you start getting into places like Kosovo, even North Macedonia, even Montenegro and Serbia, the internal political dynamics in those societies are much more complicated. And what the Europeans encounter and what they have yet to find a solution for is a kind of political, not just obstinance, as it were, on the part of local political elites, but really a very kind of perverse political genius on the part of a lot of Balkan elites in these so-called Western Balkan 6 countries. And this is, what in my book, for those of you who have encountered it, this is the concept that I kind of refer to as elastic authoritarianism, which is just a term I kind of coined to try to make sense of the way in which elites in a lot of these societies have historically been extremely adept at playing clients. They have made an art of being clients, right? So whether you want to talk about the Ottomans or the Austro-Hungarians or even the communist era or even the fascist era, and then of course into the post-Cold War era, they are very good at pretending to be on your side if you're the big actor in the region all of a sudden, so long as they can extract benefits for themselves. And the biggest benefit for them, of course, is maintaining power. But the real genius of this is when they recognize when it is necessary for them to pivot. And that's actually something that you started seeing over the last 5, 6, half decade or so period. The first time that you saw it was in living memory was in the late communist period, when a lot of these elites across the region shifted from being committed Titoists and Marxists and communists into avowed nationalists, right? That's the kind of first beat of transformation. The next beat of transformation is the one that we have seen happen most recently, when they all transform, or many of them transform, from being committed Europhiles and Atlanticists and the whole rest of it into, once again, overt illiberal authoritarian strongmen, right? Now, again, the genius of the whole thing is that they undergo these dramatic ideological transformations without ever losing power and without ever really affecting the nature of the local political economy and the nature of local political authority. And that, again, is kind of in many ways the big distinction between this region and most of the rest of the Eastern Bloc. Right. I mean, what I've referred to it essentially in a lot of my writing is that, 1989 is the year that never happened in the Western Balkans. Right. That's kind of the pithy way, as it were, to sum it up. Now, what does that mean in practice? And let's talk here sort of as sort of begin to wind down. What does that mean in the context of this decade that we've just lived through, right? The 2010s. Obviously, the financial crisis is a huge hit to the region. You do start seeing some cautious, but nevertheless significant economic improvement in most of the region, including places like Bosnia and Kosovo, which historically have been some of the poorest areas of the Western Balkans. The financial crisis is a big hit. Over the 2010s, there is a recognition on the part of both local populaces and local elites that the European project is spinning its wheels. I have had conversations, for instance, with Croatian diplomats who have told me explicitly that when they were in the final stages of the negotiations for accession into the European Union, that they were told point blank by leading EU policymakers that this is the last train. You guys are in, and it's very questionable as to whether anyone else is coming in after you. And so if you want to get on this train, get serious and do it now because the door is closing. We can close the door on you as well. Now that recognition, that idea that the European enlargement project is over has only become overtly kind of public over the last 2 or 3 years. But I think for those of us who have been watching this process very closely for the last decade or so, if not longer, it's been clear longer than that. And I think the important thing to really emphasize is that I think it was much clearer to people on the ground, ordinary men and women, far sooner than that. Which is why one of the major crises facing this entire region, whether you're talking about Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, it doesn't matter, is emigration, right? People have been leaving this region in droves, and that process has only been accelerating over the last few years. But it was going on already in the early 2010s, because already by that point, it became clear to many people on the ground that, you know, European enlargement, whatever it meant, was not happening in their lifetime. They had been willing to wait 10, 15 years, depending on where you're looking, but they weren't willing to wait out their children's lives. They were willing to sacrifice a lot of their own lives waiting, but not their children. Which is why when you look at, for instance, the demographics of who's leaving the region now, it's no longer just young people. It is white-collar professionals with jobs, with careers, the ones who have actually been quite successful in what has been a very fraught transition. They too are looking at the exits because, again, for them, it's not about them anymore. It's about their kids. So they would rather start from zero in, you know, Berlin or Vienna or wherever, Stockholm, than sacrifice their children's future on the kind of altar of waiting for the Europeans until who knows when, right? That, of course, then has a kind of percolating effect, that recognition. You know, to my mind, for instance, the protests in 2014 in Bosnia, which we can very much think about in the context of the protests that happened in Slovenia in 2012, 2013, then shortly thereafter, the so-called colorful revolution in what is now North Macedonia, you start seeing a turn to street-based politics. Because the recognition is A, the Europeans aren't coming, and B, the pretense of democratic governance in the region is collapsing. So if you want any kind of shot at, you know, dignity, never mind all the highfalutin ideas about rule of law, democracy, accountability, transparency, et cetera, you need to take matters into your own hands. Which is why, you know, the story of the decade in many ways in the region's politics has been the return of street-based politics. You've seen it most recently in a place like Serbia, where you've seen weeks and months of anti-regime protests, which has, of course, also been, you know, accompanied by an overt turn towards autocracy on the part of the Vučić regime, right? So those are two strands going parallel to one another: the collapse of democratization and the eruption of street-based mobilizations. And then, of course, the kind of the last aspect of the major change that happens over the last decade is the disappearance of what we used to traditionally refer to as the international community, which is to say the political West, right? It's not just that the Europeans have checked out, it's the Americans have checked out. And on top of it all, there's new kids on the block. Here come the Russians, here come the Chinese, here comes Turkey, here come the Gulf states. And these are countries that don't care about rule of law. They don't care about reform. There is no pretense of attempting to affect change or transformation. In fact, for them, the existing setup is what they want. They want to work with these crooked elites. And yes, they offer less money than the Europeans. Yes, they offer fewer incentives than the Americans, but they offer the right incentives and the right money to the right people, which is something that I've struggled really to explain to my European colleagues, because I always have this conversation with people like in Brussels, but like, you know, we spend 10 times more money than the Russians. Like, yeah, but you spend money on highways and schools and hospitals. They spend it on giving money to, you know, local party bosses. right? That's the difference. And so this is, I think, kind of the broader texture of how we understand why suddenly the Western Balkans have really once again become a deeply, deeply politically relevant place for Europe and the United States, arguably, and why they've become a site of geopolitical contestation. I'm aware of the fact that, realistically speaking, still the Western Balkans are quite marginal, but they're in many ways less marginal than they were in the 2000s. And the threat, unfortunately, is that if conditions on the ground continue to deteriorate, as they have continued to deteriorate, they will become more relevant in the worst possible way in the decade to come. Now, I do see some potential positive avenues sort of emerging, as it were, as well as some threats. But perhaps I'll leave those kind of for the Q&A if people are interested in that. I guess, the kind of the last thing that I would say about the whole thing is that, the Western Balkans in many ways has really been a laboratory of post-Cold War politics. And so virtually any aspect of post-Cold War politics that one is interested in, you can kind of trace out a strand in the region, which is why I think, for better or for worse, we continue having these conversations about it. So thank you, and I'll take your questions.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. It's fantastic. First of all, I really do appreciate, because the text that you have, and I always wanted to ask, like now I have a chance, but because the title is so catchy, right? Hunger and Fury. How come Hunger and Fury? But thanks for walking us and clinging to your last, I'll abuse my power as a moderator here today to start with the first questions in the conversation. But you pointed out something which is a very important and close and dear to me, the understanding that actually Balkans, and specifically Western Balkans, are a laboratory for postmodern politics. And there are multiple lessons, I think, not only politically, but in a number of other, in cultural, historical perspectives that we can take out from the region and try to actually forecast what's going on. And my first question in terms of forecasting, because that might be a little bit counterintuitive, is for people in Washington and Brussels, and certainly for analysts which are deeply involved as you are, is there a way of something that you have described, which I will use a IPE term, as competitive state capture? I mean, honestly, we know that our elites in this region have become absolute masters in comparison worldwide, I think, of what you describe of becoming clients. So is there a way out of this notoriously vicious circle into which you have competitive elites, and they have the facade game playing, by democratic rules, but actually what really, is going on, what you referred to, kind of the awakening of street politics and the feeling anywhere in Sofia, all the way to Sarajevo, in every big city, where people are telling you, look, what we're witnessing is that they are different in name only, right? As if we're, addressing, and that's why I would argue later that, deep state conspiracies are also so popular, because what people are seeing is competitive parties of different colors, except that their big goal is to grab the state resource. It's not so much even the external resource. People don't even understand that it's the state budget. When you will distribute accordingly to your clientelism, and everything else is stopping. So my first question to you is there a way out? It's been playing out ever since, I would argue, actually, even during late socialism. If you consider the fact that Bulgaria is, as Dr. Neuberger is discussing multiple times, 4 times hidden bankruptcies, right? And bailouts. So we, like in the region, became masters of finding our principal agent, relationship, and getting us bailout, the promise that we'll do better next time. And this next time, turns out, as you're describing in the book and so on, is pumping out people and, described as what Krastev is talking about, as the imitation game. So we're really good at the imitation games. Is there a way out of the competitive state capture, and can we go beyond the imitation game, or that's mission impossible?
I mean, first of all, those are excellent questions, and thank you especially for highlighting the idea that this is a little bit of a a pet peeve of mine. I think there's been a lot of work done on like neoliberalism in the Western Balkans. And it's not so much that I have a problem with that analytical framework. It's just not accurate. We don't have neoliberalism. You know, usually the people using that terminology are self-identifying Marxists anyway. And if you're really going to wear that hat, then read your Marx. What we have in the region is primitive accumulation. Right? If we're going to use Marxist discourse, which I don't use myself, but I mean, because fundamentally, there's no such thing as private enterprise, really, or a free market in this region. It is dispossession. It is dispossession, and primarily of public resources, and it is primarily obsession with the capture of the state. Because the state is the fundamental economic unit in these societies. It has remained as such. Now, how do you address this? Well, to my mind, I think you know, and I think depending on who you are, this is either a kind of optimistic or pessimistic answer, but to me, it's an optimistic answer. Democracy is a process, as I think a lot of people are going to discover in this country, because there's elections coming up in a few years yet again, and we're going to keep having them. It's a process. It takes a long, long time. My argument in the book especially is that, to my mind, democratization as an actual social process, as a process that is led at the grassroots level, that is really transforming the society, that process is only about 10 years old, right? So it's actually younger than the kind of state building process that took place and was internationally led for longer than that in the case of Bosnia since 95, 96, in the case of, say, Kosovo or North Macedonia, you know, 2000, 2001, right? That's not actually at all to disparage that internationally led process. That was critical. That was absolutely imperative. But that is different from wholesale social transformation. It is different to have an institutional setup and an institutional framework and have a democratic culture. And again, a lot of what you've seen take place in the West over the last decade is the inversion of that in turn, right? Where you have, on the face of it, very stable, old, consolidated democratic institutions, but you start seeing erosion in the democratic culture. And what starts happening? Well, all kinds of the liberal forces start winning office. And then they start undermining even those institutions. In the Western Balkans, we obviously don't have those kinds of consolidated institutions to begin with. So for us, the fact that we've essentially had, you know, de facto mafia regimes in power for the better part of, you know, 3 decades, it's been very, very difficult to enact progress. Now, ultimately, to my mind, and you know, this is again the sort of the policy hat aspect of it, I think you need the bottom up and you need the top down, right? What we had in, I would say, the first decade of the region after the wars was that we had a lot of top down and very little bottom up. Over the course of the last decade, we had a fair bit of bottom up, not very much top down, right? So now what we're hoping for in the 2020s, you know, lessons learned on everyone's part, local and international, is to combine the two.
Yasmin, I absolutely agree, except that, you know, and I'll let off, you know, people to participate in the conversation, but, you know, you touched upon something very important, you know, like the bottom up versus top down approach, but yet you were saying that conditionality, basically, you know, on the EU's part, you know, as a mechanism, you know, to work with the elites is simply not working. So, you know, are we witnessing a flawed process and, you know, flawed design? You know, you've started by saying that this is not applicable here, you know, and this is, you know, when you were giving the example with the Croatian diplomats, you know, guys, you know, either get in the train or it is. In my reality as a political advisor, I starkly remember conversations, you know, also about Bulgaria and Romania going in the same, you know, direction, when basically the local elites behind closed doors will tell, well, you know what, you know, now that we're in, what else could happen? You know, okay, they will, you know, ultimately stop the money, but at a certain point, you know, so is the magic gone?
Yes and no. I think the magic, as you have seen, for instance, for those of you who follow the region's events quite closely, you may recall that, you know, just a couple of months ago, we had sort of the major reimagining of the accession process at the behest of French complaints, you know, who twice blocked North Macedonia and Albania from beginning negotiations, and it was all very dramatic. Here's the thing. I thought that the French position was politically tone deaf and even politically dangerous because of how they went about cashing in their chips. North Macedonia and Albania had been promised a lot to do some very, very painful changes. North Macedonia, most of all, because they changed their name. And when it was time to begin the negotiations, the Europeans yanked the rug from them. I thought that was a terrible signal. However, on the flip side, the position that the accession process needed to be reimagined and rebooted was correct. It just shouldn't have been done the way it was done, that it was essentially used to punish North Macedonia and Albania and hold them hostage. The point that I'm trying to make is, yes, the accession process is insufficient, but it is necessary in many ways. I'm very pro-European, but I don't think EU membership is the end of history, as we have seen in Hungary and Poland. And I think that was always exceedingly both naive and dangerous to insist that was the case. My kind of earnest hope when I'm thinking long term is that ultimately that there will be a kind of reform process that will happen in tandem, both within the EU developing its own capacities to deal with illiberal actors, and that the accession process will actually become more substantive and that it will become more transformative. And to my mind, the way that happens is that the process has to be expanded, by which I mean it has to be expanded to a greater number of actors from within societies to participate in Europeanization. It's insufficient to strictly boil the whole thing down perpetually to a kind of government-to-government discourse or dialogue, rather. Right, that it just doesn't work. I understand that at the tail end, when policies have to be enacted, laws have to be made. Of course, that's a government thing. But in order to get that process, you have to use the apparatus of the European Union to entice, encourage, and cement the participation of civil society and just a much larger swath of citizenry in the process. And even that, ultimately is going to be extremely long. It's going to be extremely challenging, and there is no guarantee of success. But the alternative ultimately is not doing that and watching the whole thing go up in flames. And the thing about the present moment is that I think what the Europeans have finally started to realize is their longtime narrative about how they were, quote unquote, the only game in town, that's gone. That's gone. There is an alternative. Local elites definitely believe there's an alternative, and it is the alternative that is being offered to them by the likes of Russia and Turkey and even Hungary, right? They think there is an alternative model. It behooves the Europeans in particular to make sure that they, make clear that, no, for lack of a better term.
Well, thank you for that. I'll turn to Dr. Neuberger, but thank you I didn't spare you the hard one, because I know that this always comes up, and some of the conversations are not very pleasant, as you know, neither in academia nor among political decision makers, and but needs to be said. Dr. Neuberger.
Well, I hate to hog the second question always, or sometimes the first. But no, I found this really fascinating. Your concept of elastic authoritarianism especially intrigues me. And I was thinking, is it more of a sort of chameleon kind of thing that's going on? And if so, are we saying that politics are kind of aesthetics? In other words, you just change your color, but actually you don't change structurally. I mean, and so I'm kind of interested in that. But also this relationship to the West, I just want to ask you more about, because, it's something I've been thinking about for a long time and looking at it historically. And well, first of all, there's not just one West, of course, there's many, which makes it even easier to kind of have this sort of client relationship thing work for you, because you can kind of shift your client, so to speak. And the US kind of became a different client in the last 4 years than, I think, even more so than in the past from Europe. But But it seems to me there's a sort of Balkan lesson from the 19th century around the West and how to get the attention of the West. And there's one way to do it, and it's violence. When you're not being violent, then everything must be fine there. So we can kind of tinker here and there and maybe talk about reforms, but we don't really have to be fully involved until there's violence. And then we're 100% there.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder, like, what kind of, do you think there are any prospects for kind of a more violent activity moving into the future to try and, I suppose, get more international kind of attention or intervention around specific issues?
I think I'll start with that second question first. The short answer is, and I'll be careful about how I answer it. The answer is that the prospects for violence are still relatively slim, but they are greater than they were 10 years ago. So the security situation in the region has deteriorated fairly significantly, actually. You know, in the case of Bosnia, for instance, you have very, very credible threats at secession by the Serb nationalist authorities in the country, and increasingly also Croat nationalist authorities who work very closely in tandem with the Dodik regime. We've seen the Dodik regime, for instance, make very, very concrete steps towards creating a parallel security apparatus that triggered possibly the most serious security crisis in Bosnia since the war. And that was within the last year and a half or so. And, you know, we have to be very clear, any attempt to break up the Bosnian state would immediately result in another war. Right. I mean, it's a non-starter. And would the war be on the scale of what we saw in the 1990s? Probably not. You know, the comparison that I've used for the last few years when I've spoken to policymakers in the West is, you know, it would probably be more on the level of the Troubles in Northern Ireland at the worst. Possibly, you know, some of the lower points of the Lebanese civil war in terms of overall scale of violence. But it would be, I mean, from the perspective of the kind of broader European security architecture, it would be a catastrophe, especially from the perspective of the amount of resources that have been put into this region to make sure that this would never happen again. And of course, you know, now we are in a very, very different international climate than we were in the 1990s. And I mean, this is one of the things that I gesture out in the book as well. You know, states like Russia and Turkey, for instance, would almost certainly be far bigger actors in any kind of renewed actual violence in the region than they were in the 1990s. I mean, the reality is in the 1990s, you know, the United States and eventually the United Kingdom, but let's say more broadly, the US and the EU, could essentially drag their feet indefinitely and make up their minds as to whether they wanted to do anything or not. The Russians were there at the margins. Turkey was even more marginal than that, but they were simply not a relevant factor, right? It was the West's decision to make, and they made it when they made it, and it had the consequences that it had. Today, it would be a completely different picture. And I mean, it's not a one-to-one comparison, of course, but you only have to look at, for instance, the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. Right? I mean, the Europeans and the Americans are not involved. Should they be involved? That's a different question, but they're not involved. And it's, you know, it is being decided entirely by local and regional actors.
Yes, and it's a normative question. You make a very good point. You know, should versus what is going, and it's going just because it's not on our screen, just like Syria and a number of other things which are in geographic straight proximity to the Balkans. It doesn't mean that those things are gone. It just simply means that our attention has shifted.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, I'm just
no. It's exactly right. It's exactly right.
The reason why we do in, you know, Balkan Circle is just to point out a certain number of issues, not political, but, you know, cultural, structural, and so on.
Absolutely.
Historical are there. Speaking of which, when you were talking about Macedonia, I just want to point out that the biggest, you know, news, you know, which I didn't want it to start intentionally the circle today, is that actually the so-called historical commission, right, of, you know, Sofia is blocking, as it seems currently, North Macedonia yet one more time. It's just didn't want it to run into political passions right now. I'm just pointing out that simply because, you know, somebody is not paying attention currently here in this country or in Brussels, more importantly, it doesn't mean that those things are gone and away and solved for, you know, and put into a museum, you know, for teaching artifact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll just plug the podcast right now and tell you that the next episode is going to be on this issue between Bulgaria and North Macedonia. And we just spoke to Dimitar Bechev, who some of you might know. And
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Dimitar was, actually a guest before you.
there you go. There you go. He was also my neighbor for like much of the last 3-4 years. So it's a very small world.
It's a small world. It's not a lot of specialists that are working on the Balkans. But,
exactly.
We tend to have this, meeting point of everyone who's seriously and deeply involved academically and, in their practitioner capacity. At this point of time, Dr. Neuberger, if you don't mind, I'll invite, because today I have abused, unfortunately, a lot of the time. So I'm going to ask, our participants to ask Yasmin their questions either via chat or directly. There is a lot of claims, in his book, which I agree with, but not everybody takes, without criticism. And I would love to, or, based on what you heard, you can address Yasmin as today's here with us. Keith Wagner. Hey, Keith.
Hi, it's good to be back in this group.
Thank you for coming back. We love having you.
Of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Mujanovic, for this presentation. I was really interested to hear the term Europeanization because, and this may be a question that Dr. Neuberger can address too, in relation to the European Union, like this sort of modern take on Europeanization, because I know it in the 19th century sense and maybe late Ottoman thing, and even the involvement of the role of France setting conditions. So I'm just wondering what the difference is current modern day Europeanization purely institutional, whereas maybe in the 19th century it was more cultural, and like, was it Europeanization coming from these late Ottoman societies, like the desire to be more European, versus nowadays Europeanization being sort of this imposition of conditions and policing of who gets to be European or not. Is that how you see it? Are the two related, or what's sort of the trans-historical view of Europeanization?
So obviously it's a hugely problematic and loaded term, right? From a factual standpoint, or I guess from a kind of linguistic standpoint, I would say that for much of the 2000s, Europeanization in the policy literature within the EU was used in an institutional sense. They meant making your institutions more like those of the EU or bringing them in line with the EU. I think you're absolutely right, though, that what you have started seeing in particular over the last decade, especially in the context of growing anti-enlargement sentiment in the EU and the rise of the far right and the rise of kind of xenophobic and in particular anti-Muslim sentiment, Europeanization, both the term has fallen out of favor, and I think in so much as it's still used, it's much more laden with, in a way, these kinds of 19th century Orientalist views. And certainly, I mean, to my mind, to be very explicit, the essence of the French critique of the Macron government, if you read very closely, not even that closely, but if you read closely, is great suspicion, if not hostility, to the idea that Muslim majority societies, although they are geographically in Europe, can become part of the EU. And, you know, I think there's a very simple reason for that, that French politics at this point is between the center right and the far right? That those are the two main options in France. And I mean, Macron, despite the fact that he kind of pitched himself as a liberal, quote unquote, in the European sense, I mean, I think when you boil it down to the most contentious issues in contemporary French society, which is essentially the question of integration, the role of Muslims in French society, and the threat of Islamist terrorism, pardon me, it's essentially a center-right position. And I mean, it's in many ways, even more so than that. I mean, there's a real xenophobic streak to a lot of Emmanuel Macron's politics. And obviously when he looks at, and when his cabinet looks at the prospect of letting in countries like Bosnia, Kosovo, Muslim majority societies, Albania, Muslim majority, or even countries like Montenegro and North Macedonia, which have very large Muslim minorities, you know, try selling that to the French electorate, try selling that to the Danish electorate, try selling that to the Dutch electorate. really, really problematic. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the question of Europeanization has really changed. And I mean, again, we're seeing how, it's very much in parallel with what is going on in Europe proper, which is to say the EU. It's not just that there's been an issue with the scale and nature of transformation in the Western Balkans. It's also the case that there's been some profound political transformations in the EU itself, which have made the prospect of enlargement much, much less likely. I mean, I'll be blunt, there's not going to be enlargement in this decade. I can't see it happening. I'm willing to allow for the fringe possibility that Montenegro might get in, but I really, really doubt that we're going to see anything before 2030. So it'll be the first decade, actually, since the whole kind of enlargement thing began, at least since the end of the Cold War, that we're not going to have a single new member state.
Thank you, Yasmin. I see that our colleague, Dr. Vlad Beronia, is having a question. Vlad?
Hi. Yeah, thank you for your really wonderful and sophisticated analysis. I really enjoy that. So my question was going to be kind of along the same lines as Keith's and sort of the critiques that were coming out of certain kind of critics in the Balkans about, mostly of the kind of post-colonial or sort of semi-post-colonial nature, about the kind of imposed nature of Europeanization, as well as which came with this package of this kind of humanitarian experiment in the Balkans, and is reflected in certain kind of patronizing attitudes and institutions like the institution of the High Commissioner in Bosnia, obviously, and I think you wonderfully write about that. So I wanted to kind of, what do you say to those kind of critiques? And then I guess my larger question is about, do we just have kind of two choices, one being sort of Euro-Atlanticism and the other being, illiberal authoritarianism? Are there any, is there any room for something third or fourth to emerge as well? So I guess those are my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Those are, I mean, you're very generous, first of all, and they're very, very good questions. I mean, I'm going to give you probably a bit of an unsatisfying answer, and I'll preface the answer by saying that it's an answer that comes out of my own experiences and frustrations. I'll be quite honest about that also. I mean, I'm somebody who comes very much out of a kind of historically kind of an activist background. And I'm very sympathetic to sort of, social movement literature and the role of activism. And I absolutely kind of front load the notion of participatory democracy in my kind of broader understanding of democracy. And in so much as I continue to be kind of a policy person, I've been extremely on board with, labor struggles, LGBT struggles, Roma struggles. All of these things are critical. And yes, there's absolutely a role for transporter solidarity in this region. I think we've seen some really wonderful things in that sense happen in the context, for instance, of the protests in Bosnia in 2014. There were some really important solidarity actions, in Serbia, in Croatia, in North Macedonia, then at the time of the colorful revolution, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things are absolutely necessary and they are vital. At the same time, I think we have to be very sober and very realistic about the state of politics in the region. The reality is that reactionary political movements in this region are absolutely dominant, and they set the terms of engagement, which is to say that what is possible is oftentimes determined by just how reactionary and how overtly authoritarian these regimes are. And of course, then there is always the issue of the extremely toxic role of nationalism in the region after the wars. I think there's been some really important civil society-led kind of reconciliation efforts in this region. That having been said, For instance, just to use as a kind of example, when we look at the state of the mainstream discourse in Serbia, for instance, about the nature of the Yugoslav dissolution and post-war Yugoslav politics, we have to be very sober and very honest. The mainstream position in Serbia is one of historical revisionism. On the main opposition side, and of course on the government side, right? So that really complicates and limits the kinds of possibilities, as it were, that we can imagine. That also means that I think when we are talking about things like, as you put it, Euro-Atlanticism, from my perspective, I these days honestly am more concerned about Atlanticism than I am concerned about the Euro part, because I don't think European enlargement is going to happen anytime soon. And I'm also really concerned about some of the things that are happening within the European Union and the role of even European Union states like Hungary, for instance, which has become much more involved in regional politics in a deeply problematic way. So for me, for instance, as much as, for instance, some of my colleagues who might identify, with kind of left-wing politics or progressive politics or activist politics, for me, when I look at it from the perspective, for instance, of Bosnia-Herzegovina, NATO is an existential question for us. That might not win a lot of credentials, as it were, in activist circles, but from a realpolitik standpoint, for us to be able to advance progressive politics, we have to have a baseline of security and stability, which I have a very hard time imagining in the long term in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the region as a whole without being under the umbrella of the Atlantic Aegis. Does that mean I am, without criticism of NATO or kind of the liberal democratic project more broadly? Absolutely not. But I do think within the realm of possible politics, it is the best option that we have. And in so much as we want to imagine different futures for ourselves and we want to build more progressive societies and policies in the decades to come, it's, there simply isn't the capacity for a kind of non-Euro-Atlantic progressive politics that can take on the nationalist establishment in the region. That just doesn't exist right now. It might exist at some point. But it's not there right now. And to my mind, it is dangerous. I mean, I'll be very blunt. It is dangerous, and in this case, in this sense, I feel it very, very personally. It is dangerous to my family and the communities that I am plugged in for us not to pursue the politics of European and Atlantic integration, because I worry profoundly about the Western Balkans if we go all the way, for instance, with what we have started seeing in Serbia. If Aleksandar Vučić becomes explicitly an autocrat, if you start seeing the kinds of reversions, for instance, in North Macedonia that you saw under the Gruevski regime, if somebody like Milorad Dodik goes all the way with the kind of political adventurism that he fantasizes, if somebody like Bakir Izetbegović in Bosnia-Herzegovina succeeds in transforming the parts of Bosnia that his party aspires to control into literally a personal family fiefdom, I worry about these things profoundly because they will have
politics.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, this is so. I think as it were, and I don't mean this in a patronizing way at all, but I do always think to myself, what is the responsible activist position? And the responsible activist position, to my mind, is to look out for the most vulnerable in our communities. And to my mind, the best way to accomplish that is to continue along with the process of European Atlantic integration for all its flaws and challenges.
Thank you, Yasmin, for addressing this, and thanks to Dr. Barone for a wonderful and provocative question. It's not easy again. We never promised, Yasmin, that we're not going to put you on the spot today. And I have two more questions fielded for you. One of them is from Michael Keel, who's been working and monitoring, civil society in Serbia in particular. And then we do have a question from Dr. Jason Roberts, who will be asking you a question about traditionalism in Serbia, something I think is something you've been, addressing already. to develop it. But Michael, would you ask your question?
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Michael. I'm a master's student here at UT, and yeah, thank you for the talk. I really have enjoyed it so far. Even like getting into some of the like linguistic words and terms we use and ideas that sort of are behind all of that. I really enjoyed, and so I've written a couple of things down, sort of to follow on what Dr. Baronia said. I find the shifting timelines really interesting in like discourse, and like when I think originally people thought that Serbia or Montenegro could have joined by now, 2015 or even earlier perhaps. But so in terms of like a kind of a third way, I see in like some of the research I want to do with my master's thesis, looking at like Belgrade specifically and how they try to carve out space in the region, that accession being pushed back really benefits them in the sense that then they don't have to confront issues about Kosovo in terms of like politicians and get to play sort of all these different powers against each other and build relationships with like the EU and Russia and China and even like the US at the same time. And so I guess like I would be interested to talk about like various influences on that, whether it's like the Serbian diaspora in different parts of Europe and how they interact sort of transnationally, but I guess because people in the EU are so ambivalent about adding more countries. One thing I would be interested in your thoughts on is the $3 billion sort of like bailout that the EU gave this summer, because originally I thought it was like, there's always talks about like renewing the process, etc. I was like, this is a good sign. And then my colleagues in North Macedonia were like, well, not exactly, because like the money will go to wherever it goes, and it's not necessarily like to the right places. So I guess to sum that up in a question, I'd be curious like whether it's this aid specifically that happened this summer or in general, when the EU is like sending like large sums of money, like how particularly like elites get to use that, and like maybe how it like becomes more obfuscated and hidden.
Yeah, so I mean, so big picture, the big picture problem is that, and this is something that I was alluding to at the beginning of the talk and something that I talk about in the book as well, right? The idea was always, we give you money, we give you perks, we give you the prospect of membership, and you play nice. What local elites have discovered in places like Bosnia and Serbia is that you send us money and then we pretend not to hear the rest, right? And in practice, a lot of the time what's happened is that the money comes first, and then, it's kind of like, now remember, you said that you were gonna, I have a toddler, so I know when I can give her a treat. The treat comes after she has done the thing I want her to do, not before. The problem is that, I mean, you can talk about it in the kind of very vague structural way that I was just talking about it now, and then you can really boil it down to nitty gritty things. Like one of the things that I've pushed the Europeans on whenever I've had the opportunity is that, they need anti-corruption legislation that is much, much better than they have. They do not have the equivalent of FARA at the European level. Euroval, Europol, these are institutions that exist and have a mandate to pursue money laundering, graft, corruption in a much more aggressive way than they have done to date. And it's also something that needs to be integrated much more forcefully into the accession process. And I mean, this is one of the lessons learned, not just of places like Bulgaria, Romania, but also Cyprus. All right. I mean, Cyprus is probably the most egregious example of them all. I mean, Cyprus it was in the 90s, incidentally, that's where Milosevic parked billions of dollars, right? Literally in suitcases and duffel bags. Like,
they put them on planes and
Yasmin, just think about, Al Jazeera's current investigation, about the, the investment versus for
Exactly.
citizenship scheme, right?
Exactly.
And,
Exactly.
all of a sudden you see the list of people with, I have to have a careful choice of words, of interesting biographies that all of a sudden became EU citizens,
Right.
and that questions, begs the question about the standard of, this belonging versus not, which I think, Keith and Vlad Baroni and so on were talking about. I mean,
Exactly.
this is, I think, the part that rubs really badly, the non-elites at
Mhm.
certain point, which are kind
Oh,
of like looking at this dynamic and saying like, why me waiting, as you said, versus the strategy of leaving, which I
Exactly.
think is the next big topic, right? For the Balkans, it is the depopulation
Yeah.
and the shocking sort of reversal of people that probably need the most migration in are the ones that are turning, the societies into fortresses and closing any possible reasonable conversation about that. So Yasmin, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask Dr. Roberts to ask this question before I'm going to ask Professor Neuberger to close our meeting today. Thank you. Dr.
Right.
Roberts.
Am I unmuted? I think I am.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I wasn't going to ask anything, but I don't know that I'm going to get this kind of an opportunity again to sort of get an orientation to a political movement in a place that speaks languages that I don't. Right. So I know of Boris Nad, and this is it in terms of what has been translated, although there is a new publishing house that does traditionalist, neo-pagan, Dugan, Evelyn stuff that specializes in bringing the wit and wisdom of traditionalists and Eurasianists from around the world into the English language for the benefit of the American people. And that's where I encountered Boris. I'll let you include this in your answer, but the point of my question is Dr. Avramov and I today were teaching a class where we're trying to explain Dugin's Eurasianism to a room full of undergraduates, and it is rather complicated, but one of the things that it involves is rejecting modernity, embracing what Roger Griffin has called and will call to his dying day the palingenetic myth, and the ultimate one of sort of this Kali Yuga, end of the great celestial cycle. So accelerationism, crash the plane so that we can have the great rebirth. And it appears to me that it's alive and well, not just with Alexander Dugin, but sort of smoldering or blazing in the Balkans. And that's kind of what does anybody care about Boris Nad? Have you heard of him? Probably. That's the orientation that I want is, did I find something that nobody knows about, or is it trickling in?
I'll give you two answers. One is I have heard of him and people have heard of him, but it's still a pretty marginal phenomenon. However, the broader issue that you're talking about, the proliferation of, in particular, sort of Duginite political thinking and the kind of broader architecture of the Eurasian ideological framework, and more broadly, the kind of Ruski Mir project definitely has begun to take very, very deep roots in the region. And what's very interesting to note is that, again, and this is part of the kind of elastic authoritarianism bit, local elites have recognized that the Russians are offering them a new ideological framework and have said, yep, we want in on that. And so what you started seeing is this completely false and invented Russification, in particular of Orthodox communities in the Western Balkans. You see it in particular in places like Serbia, the RS entity in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Montenegro, right? The idea that you're building kind of churches in the Russian Orthodox style, you're putting up busts of Russian emperors, that you're creating NGOs and societies that promote things like Dugin's writing, but other kind of conspiratorial and quasi-fascist ideologies, including in the University of Belgrade, right? Like in very mainstream institutions, you're peddling this kind of stuff. And again, it's part of this transformation. It's part of creating the architecture for a new ideological program. Now, because they're still hedging their bets a little bit, and they're still waiting to see exactly which way the Europeans are going to go, are they going to basically wave us across the finish line or not? In the event that it's a not, we have a fallback, right? We have the Russians, we have the Ruski Mir, we have Slavic Brotherhood, we have Eurasianism. If they do let us in, all the better. We can still appeal to that stuff as well. Plus, we'll have our good friends in Hungary and Poland that we can caucus with, and who, you know, then the sky's the limit. But yeah, I mean, you definitely have started seeing more and more of this stuff. And for those, you know, that do really these kind of close analyses of like cultural manifestation and civil society politics, you've definitely seen a massive infiltration of Russian media, Russian information and disinformation. And again, the kind of broader process of Russification, again, which to my mind is, you know, kind of patently engineered, but obviously is not unsuccessful, unfortunately.
And thank you. I have one quick follow-up. It sounds like, and this is great if it is true, you have not been reading his books, but you are aware of him. Obviously, you're very aware of the region. So it's sort of the opposite with me, right? So I want to test to see if what I take out of the message, which is this recasting of ideology, I've sensed as well. So I want to know if it's the same one. It seems to be a move with all of them to collapse, sort of in the way that Hannah Arendt collapsed, you know, communism and fascism into one totalitarianism. The move here is to collapse communism, fascism, and liberalism into modernity, so that there is no communist critique against, or no Marxist critique against liberalism left.
Yeah.
That it is, there's no leg to stand on. And then it also sort of obscures the notion that this is fascist, or this could be fascist, because that's been rolled into the significant other. So is that sort of what you see happening, is that there are only two sides, us and modernity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty accurate. And I'll keep. Yeah, I mean, I'll keep the answer short because I know we're wrapping up. I mean, yes, you're right. You know, the other kind of obvious person to cite here would be like somebody like Edward Limonov, the other kind of you know, Russian far right figure. And I think the important thing I think to note in the context of this conversation in the region is that a lot of this discourse is still, I wouldn't say it's marginal, but it is to an extent peripheral. It is something that local authorities are very much aware of. It's something that they're encouraging in many ways. It's not quite yet what they themselves are offering, but it is something that they're encouraging their proxies to engage in, which is why a lot of these far right groups, for instance, in Serbia of various sorts, are essentially indirectly on the teat of the government. Right, they're kept on a tight leash. They know what they can and can't get away with. They know what they can and cannot say. And a lot of what they're offering is this kind of, you know, fascist, corporatist discourse, but obviously within the lexicon and within the rhetoric in particular of Serbian nationalism. The place where you've seen it recently most obviously is in Montenegro, in the context of the religious law protests, where you've started seeing this really like millennialist turn that also combines obviously kind of classic far right tropes. I mean, the last thing that I'll say, and this is like a personal point of fascination, I am absolutely fascinated by the proliferation of a new genre of like claro-nationalist music in the region. There's a young woman in Montenegro who does these like clerical Serb nationalist songs. It's wild. The videos are wild. The
What's
lyrics.
Her name? You gotta tell us her name.
Dushica Crnogorovic, I believe it's Dushica. The last name is definitely Crnogorovic. I can even send a link if you guys are interested. I mean, it's just. It's, you know,
Yasmin, you have an excellent point, because when you were saying the physical manifestation of what Dr. Roberts was saying, and you just replied, is when I was tracking my mercs in,
Yeah.
when some of the things that they have left, seized, some of the culture, that they're consuming is exactly to what you're
Yeah.
pointing out. There is
Yeah.
no surprise there as to what they read, consume in form of a popular culture and so on. And this is not to be confused, with the Turbo Folks.
Right. No.
Different
This
variations.
is very
entirely
different.
different thing, which is very detectable and palpable in what's been consumed. And on the other side as well, of course, like Russian and Ukrainian and so on in the conflict. But this is entirely new thing, and I'm so glad that you've mentioned it because it's something that to be watched. Thank you very much, Dr. Newberger. Some final thoughts for today's topic.
Yeah, well, I just want to thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I feel like I learned so much and I could keep talking to you all day, but kind of on this last point, it just made me think that I'm always a little bit suspicious of this idea of rejecting modernity, because it always seems to me that there's never really an actual effort to return to the past, but instead an effort to kind of reshape the past selectively and create a new kind of way to the future that is decidedly not traditional. So anyway, it'll be interesting to see what kind of happens in the region, but thank you so much for historicizing for us these last few decades, which I always tell all my students when I teach my interdisciplinary methods class that you need to know how to historicize and be a historian, even if you're not one. I really appreciated your ability to kind of speak across disciplines to us, coming from our different kind of angles here in this group. And it was really enlightening, and thank you. And I hope you'll come back as an audience member, and maybe we'll just have you back to speak again. But in the meantime, I've subscribed to your podcast while you're sitting here, and I will be tuning in.
Thank you very kindly. And just to say this publicly, I'm not sure what the technical aspect is, but anyone who would like to get in touch with me, I believe my email should be available, or Kito can make it available, certainly to Professor Roberts or any of the students. Please reach out. I do have 2 young kids, so I can't promise I'll always be super responsive immediately, but I get around to it eventually.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you again. Looking forward to have you next week when we are to cover again regional topics, and we will have guests. This time, we had Yasmin. Is it Los Angeles that we're talking to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Last week it was Istanbul. Now it's Los Angeles, and next week it's going to be Kosovo. So. We're keeping it, international. Yasmin, we'll thank you very much, and we're looking forward to have you back either as a speaker or as an audience.
Thank you kindly.
It's a pleasure.